Hello, and welcome back to episode 5 of Gallivanting Across British Cultural Studies. This episode, I will be covering chapter 6 of Graeme Turner's book, British Cultural Studies, an Introduction, which focuses on ideology and the historical usage of it throughout the British Cultural Studies academic tradition. While ideology certainly still figures as a dominant concept in the teaching of cultural studies, it is not nearly as prominent in cultural studies research and writing as it once was. With the focus on identity, cultural studies becomes a little more descriptive, focusing on the content of the identities under examination and their specific relation to the cultural and political environment. Larger interests served within this framework tend not to come into sharp focus, and to be fair, are routinely seen as already established and understood. Second, the category of ideology still implies, even if only vaguely, a relation of domination and subordination that no longer sits comfortably with discussion of the social distribution of power as dispersed and contingent. Here, the influence of Foucault is once again significant. As you have seen, Foucault's account of the distribution and operation of power is presented through discursive histories of systems of regulation, discipline, and behavior internalized by the human subject. So, for example, histories of the school, the prison, or the hospital might focus on the organization of time and space, the daily timetable, or the schoolroom as key elements in shaping the comportment of the subject. In such a theoretical framework, ideology looks like a slightly clumsy instrument for the analysis of both cultural institutions and structures. Nevertheless, and notwithstanding what I just previously mentioned, it's probably still true to say that ideology remains the single most important conceptual category in cultural studies, even if it remains one of the most contested. According to scholar James Carey, British cultural studies could be described just as easily and perhaps more accurately as ideological studies, for they assimilate in a variety of complex ways culture to ideology. Fellow scholar Richard Johnson usefully reminds us that the economistic recovery of a base superstructure model of society is not necessarily opposed to cultural studies versions of ideology. He makes a significant distinction, however, that within cultural relations, the outcomes of ideology or consciousness are not determined in the same kind of way as in economic or political relations. This argument emphasizes the importance of understanding just how ideology, culture, and consciousness are related to each other, and thus how any outcomes of their relationships might be analyzed. Nowadays, it's customary for cultural studies adoption of Althusserian models of ideology in the 70s to be represented as utterly deterministic or purely mechanical. Within many contemporary accounts, the similarities between Althusser and Gramsci are glossed over, and the differences exaggerated to legitimize the adaptation of Gramsci's theory of hegemony as a necessary correction to Althusserianism. Beginning with the appropriation of Althusserian theory during the 70s and the gradual incorporation of Gramscian theories of hegemony to resolve the culturalism-structuralism split. Importantly, Gramsci sees ideology as a site of particularly vigorous contestation, and the popular culture as a source of considerable resistance to hegemonic formation. Since the late 80s, this view of popular culture, coupled with the development of the notion of pleasure as a force that may oppose the workings of ideology, and with postmodernist theories that privilege sensation over meaning, has encouraged something of a retreat from ideology as the all-powerful determining force it seemed to be in the late 70s. It's useful to begin with what is still the most comprehensive attempt to formulate a cultural studies orthodoxy on ideology so far. Hall's The Rediscovery of Ideology, The Return of the Repressed in Media Studies from 1982. In this, Hall provides predominantly an account of ideology within the text, treating the function of ideology within the construction of everyday life as a secondary concern. The Return of the Repressed deals specifically with the study of the media, and nominates 3 distinct phases in media research from the 1920s to the present. Hall concentrates on the break between the second and third phases. The second phase, roughly from the 40s to 60s, is dominated by the sociological approaches of mainstream American behavioral science, while the third phase, from the late 60s to the present, sees the development of an alternative critical paradigm. Hall charts this paradigm shift as one marked not only by differences in methods or research procedures, but also by differences in political and theoretical orientations. As Hall puts it, the simplest way to characterize the shift from mainstream to critical perspectives is in terms of the movement from, essentially, a behavioral to an ideological perspective. Within the behavioral perspective, ideology was repressed, Within the critical, or within cultural studies tradition, it was recovered as the central category that connected the media to society. Hall's article concludes by outlining the ways in which the function of ideology is understood within this critical tradition. The first phase of media research, from the 20s to 40s, can be exemplified by the work of the Frankfurt School, and indeed by the British variant in the culture and civilization tradition from way back. Researchers in this phase saw the media as a powerful and largely unmediated force that had entirely negative effects on mass culture. This diagnosis was ultimately rejected, as Hall would go to suggest, by the second phase, mainstream American mass communication research in the 60s. This body of work questioned the earlier assumptions of media power, most importantly, television's potential to produce either positive or negative effects independently. Because it employed a very simple idea of media messages and of social structure, the Frankfurt School's warnings about the manipulative potential of mass culture were made redundant by pluralism. Mass communication theorists even announced an end to ideology, the abolition of unresolvable social or political conflicts. To summarize that historical time, Hall says, at the broader level, the media were held to be largely reflective or expressive of an achieved consensus. The finding that, after all, the media were not very influential was predicated on the belief that, in its wider cultural sense, the media largely reinforced those values and norms which had already achieved a wide consensual foundation. Since the consensus was a good thing, those reinforcing effects of the media were given a benign and positive reading. The development of deviance theory would reveal pluralism to be a sham, its norms serving the interests of a discriminatory definition of society and actively participating in the subordination of groups that did not fit this definition. While the definitions of specific groups as deviant were characteristically justified through reference to natural conditions, as with the ill, the insane, or the deformed, this did not explain the deviant status attributed to marginalized groups like black individuals, the poor, political demonstrators, so on. Deviance theory revealed that the differentiations between deviant and consensus formations were not natural but socially defined. Furthermore, they were historically variable. A benign and democratic process now stood exposed as a cultural power game in which the consensus ascribers defined the rules and thus determined the result. Consensus was then constructed, and that realization in turn raised questions about the role of the media in such a process. The formation of the definitions of the situation was itself a process that deserved analysis. If definitions could vary, and if they tended to be produced in ways that favored the existing social order, then the supposedly reflective role of the media, and indeed of language, needed to be reassessed. This reassessment inevitably led to the conclusion that reality could no longer be viewed as simply a given set of facts. It was the result of a particular way of constructing reality. The critical paradigm not only challenged the naturalness of the real, but also argued that the media were a key mechanism for the maintenance and exercise of centralized cultural power, responsible for influencing, shaping, and determining an individual's very wants. This influence was not exercised through the direct transmission of instructions from A to B, but rather through the ideological shaping and structuring of media representations of the world, of the real, and of the natural. This return of ideology to the agenda of mass media research opens the way for discussion of the cultural function of ideological processes. Hall would suggest these inquiries took place on two fronts. The first was the territory of cultural reception and focuses on the elaboration of ideology in languages, and the second was the articulation of ideology into social formations, territory of cultural production. Hall begins with language, drawing on post-Caesarean structuralist appropriations of semiotic models that use the language system as an analogy for all signifying structures, social practices, narratives, myths. As I mentioned a few episodes ago, Saussure argues that since meaning is not inherent in things, it has to be attributed culturally. Further, different kinds of meanings can be attributed to the same events. Hall then would ask how this process of attribution is structured. How does one meaning win credibility and acceptance while alternative meanings are downgraded and marginalized? Both of these questions are about the politics of signification, or the ways in which the social practice of making meanings is controlled and determined. Neither question has yet been categorically answered. However, the attempts to provide answers have focused on the relation between ideology and discourse, and between ideology and institutional structures. The account Hall goes on to develop focuses on the media's use of their power to signify events in a particular way, and stresses the fact that this ideological power is always contested. Ideology thus becomes a site of struggle and a prize to be won, not a permanent possession of dominant groups. But he also reminds the reader that ideology has deeper roots than the social practices of media production. It structures the most basic systems of cultural organization. Every culture has its own forms of episodic thinking that provide its members with the taken-for-granted elements of their practical knowledge. This common sense, or the construction of it, is rarely made explicit, and is often, in fact, unconscious, but it too is built upon a comprehensive foundation of ideological premises. A feature of the way things are signified to us is the invisibility of the process of signification itself. Propositions about the world implied within a news report, the superiority of capitalism over other social systems, as one example, become merely descriptive statements, facts of the case. The effect of ideology in media messages is to efface itself, allowing the messages to appear as natural and spontaneous presentations of reality. Hall talks of this phenomenon as the reality effect. Not only do we generally understand reality as a result or effect of how things had been signified, but we also recognize specific representations of reality as obvious. Hall highlights a number of concepts that follow from this reality effect. First is the idea of naturalization, the representation of an event or discourse such that it is legitimated by nature rather than problematized by history. Second is the polysemy of language, which held that the same set of signifiers could produce different meanings and thus made the effect of naturalization something to be worked at or produced. Third is the fact that meaning, once it has been seen in this contingent way, must be the result of a social struggle, or a dialectic. Before taking up this last point, Hall does warn against collapsing the notion of ideology into that of language. They are not the same thing, and ideology must be articulated through language. Second, he notes that the struggle over meaning is not to be reduced to a simple class struggle. Just as cultural studies theorists have resisted a reduction of the cultural to its economic determinants, this view of discourse and ideology is reluctant to equate them with class affiliations. Hall provides us with an example of the social struggle over meaning. In his brief account of the British general election of 1979, he reveals the power exercised through the definitions of the situation, highlighting the ideological effects of discourse while proposing that Thatcher's electoral victory was the profoundly material effect of a successful ideological bid to redefine the situation. He sets the scene by noting how closely the British working class had been aligned with the Labour Party and the Union movement until the prevailing definitions of this relationship were seriously challenged. The challenge hit at the heart of a hitherto natural alignment and replaced it with another equally natural construction of the Union movement. He resists a reduction of the notion of ideological dominance to class domination. The idea that dominance was imposed by one class on all the others was always vulnerable to the contention that ideological dominance had to be understood as something accomplished at the unconscious as well as the conscious level. The classical Marxist notion that the ruling ideas are those of the ruling classes is consequently jettisoned for the enlarged concept of hegemony. Hegemony implied that the dominance of certain formations was secured, not by ideological compulsion, but by cultural leadership. It circumscribed all those processes by means of which a dominant class alliance or ruling bloc, which has effectively secured mastery over the primary economic processes in society, extends and expands its mastery over society in such a way that it can transform and refashion its ways of life, its mores and conceptualization, its very form and level of culture and civilization in a direction which, while not directly paying immediate profits to the narrow interests of any particular class, favors the development and expansion of the dominant social and productive system of life as a whole. The critical point about this conception of leadership, which was Gramsci's most distinguished contribution, is that hegemony is understood as accomplished, not without the due measure of legal and legitimate compulsion, but principally by means of winning the active consent of those classes and groups who were subordinated within it. That lengthy Hall quote returns us to the problem foregrounded at the beginning of his article, how to account for the production of consensus. As Hall says, the pluralists were right to focus on the media's consensual role, but wrong to assume that it simply reflected a consensus already existing out there in society. Rather, he says, the media institutions actually manufacture consent. It's still very difficult, nevertheless, to explain exactly how this process occurs, because media institutions are generally free of direct compulsion and constraint, and yet freely articulate themselves systematically around definitions of the situation which favor the hegemony of the powerful.
There is a structural relation that means the media can prize their independence from but comply with dominant definitions. Hall explains it this way. Now consider the media, the means of representation, to be impartial and independent in their daily operations. They cannot be seen to take directives from the powerful, or consciously to be bending their accounts of the world to square with dominant definitions. But they must be sensitive to, and can only survive legitimately by operating within, the general boundaries or framework of what everyone agrees to, the consensus. But in orienting themselves in the consensus, and at the same time attempting to shape up the consensus, operating on it in a formative fashion, the media become part and parcel of the dialectical process of the production of consent, shaping the consensus while reflecting it, which orientates them within the field of force of the dominant social interests represented within the state. An important point to note here is that this process affects both state-owned and commercial media institutions. Hall's reference to the state is not meant to be taken too literally. This notion is often the most difficult to accept, that the broadcaster mentioned will unwittingly, if not inevitably, speak the dominant discourse. As you've seen throughout this chapter and the book, the dialectic between autonomy and determination structures the articulation of ideology within language and within institutions. This makes it necessary to insist that the broadcaster might indeed frame his or her own specific view of the truth, but will do so from within an ideological framework that itself prefers some truths and excludes others. Hall concludes by reminding his reader that there is much work to be done in this area, and that the critical paradigm's position is by no means fully developed or secure. This seminal essay centers on media research and only briefly examines the theoretical problems of outlining the function of ideology within popular culture in general. It says very little about the relations between the individual subject and their ideological structures. This aspect of cultural studies' notions of ideology has been frequently criticized. Our old friend Morley addresses this directly in his work Family Television. The fact that the issue is raised there underlines a key point, that the theoretical problems of the category of ideology underlie the key debates within all the areas we've canvassed so far, within the study of texts, of audiences, of subjectivities, of institutions, and of the construction of everyday life. While the culturalism-structuralism split may as well be dissolved nowadays, the three-way split of economic versus cultural determination versus individual agency still dominates in one form or another. Arguments about the formation of culture and the role of ideology. The power of the idea of hegemony is that it appears to accommodate all sides of this theoretical triangle. Gramsci's work, while prefiguring Althusser's emphasis on the determining role of ideology in the state, offers a more complex definition of popular culture and of ideological struggle. Tony Bennett offers an account of the turn to Gramsci in the introduction to Popular Culture and Social Relations. He outlines the strategic benefits of a theory of hegemony for the study of popular culture. Bennett begins by noting that the culturalist and structuralist traditions in cultural studies, however else they may have differed, both saw culture as governed by dominant ideologies. Disputes prospered over explanations of the maintenance of this dominance and the precise diagnosis of its structures and effects. But culture was divided into two opposing cultural and ideological camps, bourgeois and working class. Bennett suggests that Gramsci's radicalism within traditional Marxism lies in his resistance to this orthodox class-based formulation, and indeed to this orthodox view of ideology. Rather, it argues that in order for cultural leadership to be achieved, the dominant group has to engage in negotiations with opposing groups, classes, and values, and that these negotiations must result in some genuine accommodation. That is, hegemony is not maintained through the obliteration of the opposition, but through the articulation of opposing interests into the political affiliations of the hegemonic group. To quote Bennett, by the same token, of course, the members of the subordinate classes never encounter or are oppressed by a dominant ideology in some pure or class-essentialist form. Bourgeois ideology is encountered only in the compromised forms it must take in order to provide some accommodation for opposing class values. Hegemony offers a more subtle and flexible explanation than previous formulations because it aims to account for domination as something that is won, not automatically delivered by way of the class structure. Where Althusser's assessment of ideology could be accused of a rigidity that discounted any possibility of change, Gramsci's version is able to concentrate precisely on explaining the process of change. It is consequently a much more optimistic theory, implying a gradual historical alignment of bourgeois hegemony with working class interests. Most importantly, While Gramsci's account clearly recognizes the function of the state and of popular culture, it also foregrounds the ideological role of the representations of common sense, the power of the taken for granted, and thus the importance of the entire field of popular culture. Bennett notes a number of advantages the theory of hegemony has delivered to cultural analysis. First, and as we've seen already, it is disposed of a class essentialism that linked all cultural expression to a class basis. Second, it has made it possible to examine popular culture without necessarily taking a position for or against its particular manifestations, that is, without being critically elitist or uncritically populist. Third, it has underlined how movable the political and ideological articulations of cultural practices can be. A specific cultural practice does not carry a particular ideological significance internally, and so it is theoretically possible to produce, for instance, a feminist reading of Hollywood romance. It is possible, as Chantal Mouffe in 1981 has noted, to see Gramsci as having anticipated Althusser in a number of areas: interests in the material nature of ideology, its existence as the necessary level of all social formations, and its function as the producer of subjects. All these occur within Gramsci's writings, but it's only fully formulated much later by Althusser. The crucial difference between them lies in the central role negotiation and change play within Gramsci's model of society. Mouffe describes how Gramsci envisaged the process of intellectual and thus political reform through the transformation of ideologies. It is a process in which various elements within an ideological system are rearranged and then integrated or articulated into a new system. The turn to Gramsci reaffirms the importance of understanding ideology, but categorically withdraws from the installation of a monolithic or mechanical explanation of its workings. This more historically contingent and negotiated view reinforces claims for concrete, practical analysis of ideological formations within cultures, as against a mechanical reading off of ideological meanings from cultural forms. Hegemony describes the attempt to produce uniformity and coherence, but it also implies that such attempts must always, eventually, and necessarily fail. As a consequence of the incompleteness of any hegemonic tenure, there is always some residue of previous formations, surviving concrete features of a society that cannot be grasped as the dominant mode of production and its conditions of existence, but that still need to be explained. Since the turn to Gramsci, cultural studies is better equipped to provide such explanations. Earlier chapters of Turner's book show how vigorously cultural studies resisted the political economist's top-down version of ideology, as such a view marginalized the cultural into a mere effect of other forces and reduced the subject to a mere junction box within a complex but remote communication system. Cultural studies has been, constitutionally, much happier with bottom-up versions of ideology, as such versions attribute power to the subject and to the subcultural group to intervene in the signifying of political systems, and to produce change. Culturalism clearly adhered to such a view, and many structuralist interrogations of the Althusserian dominant ideology thesis indicated their sympathy with it too. Gramsci's theory of hegemony does seem uniquely well designed for its ultimate deployment as the consensual principle within cultural studies' conceptions of ideology. It does allow for power to flow bottom up, and severely qualifies assumptions about the effectiveness of power imposed from the top down. It is not alone, however, in its role as a support for theories of resistance to ideological domination. The latter half of the 1980s was marked by a proliferation of interest in the ways in which ideologies fail to determine, fail to interpolate the subject, and fail to prefer readings. Michael de Certeau is an influence in this area. In The Practice of Everyday Life from 1984, de Certeau emphasizes the tactics employed by subordinated groups to win small victories from larger, more powerful, and ultimately determining systems. De Certeau argues that, while members of popular culture cannot gain control of the production of culture, they do control its consumption, and the ways in which it is used. Like ethnographic audience researchers, de Certeau emphasizes how creative popular culture is, how its members continually seek out ways of operating that serve their own interests while appearing to acknowledge the interests of the dominant group. If popular culture has to make do with what is offered to it, it still has the potential to make over these offerings to its own ends. When de Certeau talks of renting a house as an insinuation of oneself into another's place, he is choosing to emphasize not the economic power the landlord has over the tenant, but the tenant's power to change the nature of the space itself. In addition to simply living in the apartment, the tenant can repaint, move the furniture, redecorate, change the garden, and fill the premises with friends or offend the neighbors by playing loud music or having parties. Through such tactics, the tenant will actively serve his or her own ends and implicitly challenge the power of ownership enjoyed by the landlord. This, while still paying rent and thus serving the landlord's economic interests. We can see the similarity between de Soto's approach and that taken by our old bud Heidegger in Subculture. In both cases, a process of bricolage makes over cultural forms and practices in order to produce moments of resistance, opposition, and subversion. Thus, while cultural structures are strategically organized to control the kinds of meanings and pleasures we produce, they are always vulnerable to the possibility that we may actually use these structures to produce subversive, resistant effects. Yet, the determining power of ideology is significantly challenged by two theoretical developments which have emerged since the mid-1980s: the examination of the role of pleasure and postmodernism. The introduction of pleasure as a category separate from ideology has changed the landscape of cultural studies. There exists a competing perspective, however, that has gathered force more recently, and that draws on a number of different influences. First, Bakhtin's theory of the carnivalesque has been widely and often carelessly adapted to conceive popular culture as intrinsically a source of resistance. Its illicit, denigrated pleasures not only offending, but also subverting the control of its masters. One can see how this might dovetail with Brechtian notions of the popular as somehow organic and authentic, the natural source of opposition to bourgeois domination. The second, and perhaps more important, influence is from Roland Barthes, who has separated one aspect of pleasure entirely from ideology. Barthes, in his 1975 work, likens jouissance to orgasm. It is an overwhelming expression of the body and thus beyond ideology, a product of nature rather than of culture. Barthes' initial suggestion has been widely taken up. By some, the body has been separated off and made the location for the last stand, as it were, against cultural determination. The idea releases other potentials as well, of addressing areas of experience that have been left out of the account so far, sexual pleasure for one, but also laughter, or the visceral pleasures some find on roller coasters and others find watching car chases on movie screens. All of this represents, potentially at least, a radical volte-face from Marxist cultural analysis. Barthes' notion calls up something very similar to the romantic ideal of the essential individual who experiences such pleasure, and who does so beyond the appeal of ideology. If the body as the location of pleasure is seen to be separable from a subject that is constructed through language and ideology, then we've reached the limits of theories of ideology. All these strategies attempt to account in one way or another for a dimension of the subjective experience, or aesthetic experience, of cultural forms and practices that is in some way resistant to dominant ideologies. Fisk's television culture, while by no means deserving the boogeyman status it seems to have acquired, still represents the most uncompromising use of this understanding of pleasure. It celebrates popular television as playfully resistant to ideological control. Television is a semiotic democracy that recognizes the rights of consumers to make what sense they will of the pleasures on offer and rewards them through a process of empowerment. And yet, pleasure is also hegemonic, inscribing the subject into a message that is marked by its structured polysemy, as well as by its negotiated character. Critics of these arguments remind us that the central conflict between determination and agency must be maintained in cultural studies. However, one might argue that it is important to acknowledge that the pleasure of popular culture cannot lie outside hegemonic ideological formations. Pleasure must be implicated in the ways in which hegemony is secured and maintained. Pleasure, whether ideologically or physically produced, is among the means of production of this consent. The relations among pleasure, cultural power, desire, and popular culture have not so far been adequately theorized. They constitute a key current issue for cultural studies. There's some progress being made, however. We can say that pleasure must not be understood as either solidly ideological, repressive, or solidly liberatory. Furthermore, we can say that there is no general form of pleasure with ascertainable political and cultural effects. The second development, of course, has to do with postmodernism and post-structuralism, the two of which hang heavy over pretty much any theoretical attempt to understand ideology and superstructure dynamics. The proposition of the arrival of the postmodern era has, of course, been massively influential within the social sciences and the humanities, as well as within popular discourses in the media and in design professions such as architecture. Originally drawn from arguments made within architecture, theories of postmodernity suggest we are experiencing a break with some of the fundamental assumptions of modernity. As we shall see later, evidence of this break is discovered in a dizzying range of cultural and economic forms and trends, but they all share the capacity to fracture and fragment continuities, histories, traditions, and forms. identified by Jameson with shifts in the structure and process of late capitalism, and by Baudrillard with the changing cultural function of representation, postmodernism is enormously expansive in its implications and notoriously difficult to define. Postmodernism's own conscientious skepticism about stable definitions, grand explanatory narratives, and the status of the history it sets out to periodize contribute to this difficulty. Relevant aspects of postmodernist theory in this context include its postulation of the disconnect between the signified and the signifier, the free play of the signifier privileging the power of the reader to decode the message in his or her interests, and, in some of its formulations, the celebration of the popular, which emerges from a critique of modernist, that is, elitist or progressive, accounts of mass culture. Georgina Bourne has described what Jim McCougan later called cultural populism as the postmodern perspective in cultural studies. The point is to blast open the view of commercial cultural goods as closed, unequivocal, and aesthetically impoverished, hence the references to post-structuralist notions of the end of the author, indeterminate readings, and the fragmented but active reading subject, to reception aesthetics, and from semiotics to the idea from cultural texts as polysemic, open, grasped through a struggle for the sign. A complication is that, as Kellner would suggest, there are at least three families of terms used to frame discussions of the postmodern. These distinguish between modernity and postmodernity as two different historical eras, between modernism and postmodern as two different aesthetic and cultural styles, and between modern and postmodern theory as two different theoretical discourses. There is no systemic relation between these families of terms, and it is common for any one of them to be invoked as if it is alone. In practice, the definition of the postmodern in specific texts and cultural formations is almost infinitely flexible. Dick Heidegger, in a famous and very long passage, gives us some sense of the problem. I quote, "When it becomes possible for people to describe as postmodern the decor of a room, the design of a building, the diegesis of a film, the construction of a record or a scratch video, a television commercial or an arts documentary, or the intertextual relations between them, the layout of a page in a fashion magazine or critical journal, an anti-teleological tendency within epistemology, the attack on the metaphysics of presence, a genuine attenuation of feeling, the collective chagrin and morbid projections of a post-war generation of baby boomers confronting disillusioned middle age, the predicament of reflexivity, a group of rhetorical tropes, a proliferation of services, a new phase in commodity fetishism, a fascination for images, codes, and styles, a process of cultural, political, or existential fragmentation and or crisis, the decentering of the subject, an incredulity towards meta-narratives, the replacement of unitary power axes by a plurality of power discourse formations, the implosion of meaning, the collapse of cultural hierarchies, the dread engendered by the threat of nuclear self-destruction, the decline of the university, the functioning and effects of the new miniaturized technologies, broad societal economic shifts into a media, consumer, or multinational phase, a sense, depending on who you read, of placedness, or the abandonment of placelessness, critical regionalism, or even a generalized substitution of spatial for temporal coordinates. When it becomes possible to describe all of these things as postmodern, or more simply using a current abbreviation as post or very post, then it's clear that we are in the presence of a buzzword. Heidegger, again, is useful here in this very long and certainly hyperfluous quote. He locates three principles common to all varieties of postmodern theory which run against the grain of a neo-Gramscian British cultural studies, although he stops short of constructing a polar opposition between the two intellectual movements. These principles involve a negation of large totalizing theories or grand narratives, of teleology, in this context something like an ideal concept of the Lacanian real, and of utopias. On the face of it, British cultural studies' Marxian roots would place it in an opposition to all three principles. Furthermore, British cultural studies has been continually concerned with interrogating certain political and discursive categories, the nation, the national past, heritage, and so on, which postmodernism spurns as tainted by their implication in grand narratives or made redundant by one of postmodernism's own grand narratives, the process of transnationalism and globalism. Finally, British cultural studies' implicit populism, a populism which can extend, as we have seen, to a sentimental investment in the living textures of popular culture, may be very comfortable within some formations of postmodernity, but radically conflicts with the more elitist, higher aesthetic of the postmodernism identified with Lyotard or Baudrillard. Corner and Harvey, in their 1991 text, also criticized an easy relativism in postmodern analyses, again challenging the usefulness of substituting theories of difference for a predominantly class-based analysis. Furthermore, what they clearly regard as the ahistorical nature of postmodern analysis is sternly rejected. In Television Audiences and Cultural Studies, from 92, Morley suggests that cultural studies needs to think of the media and communication systems in new ways, as processes in the construction of a postmodern geography. By this, he means how communications technologies of all kinds are involved in the ongoing construction and reconstruction of social spaces and social relations. In Spaces of Identity, Morley and Robbins continue to deal with some of the terms central to British cultural studies: nation, culture, identity, but respond more than most in this tradition to the transformations which have occurred within the globalizing media industries. Haunted by a relatively new preoccupation for British cultural studies, the construction and maintenance of a European identity, Morley and Robbins look at the way in which space, time, and identity are being restructured by the new communications geography. As a result, the two perceive a global identity crisis, within which the construction of identity in Britain and Europe requires rethinking. How the imagined community must now be imagined has undergone major industrial shifts. It's a sign of the fundamental need to tie cultural analysis to cultural politics, of grounding the analysis in an assessment of the contemporary alignments of political power. It's here where the somewhat metaphysical manifestations of both ideology and hegemony require grounding in quantitative, real-life work. As you can see, ideology has played a pretty important role in shaping almost the entirety of cultural studies textual tradition. And as someone coming at this, in the 2020s, kind of almost 30 years after the postmodern revolution, where post-structuralist theory is so integral to basically any cultural theory, it's very interesting seeing the tension arise between groups which I'd always assumed were similar or related, at least, in their ideological goals. Nonetheless, I think this chapter does provide a pretty comprehensive view of the subject, to say the least, and was certainly informative for myself in understanding some historical context behind this scholarship, and linking it more closely to, I guess, our modern conceptions of these things. It's always important, at least to remind myself, that the media structures and institutions that a lot of these older British works are directly analyzing are almost entirely foreign to our internet-led landscape of today. Nonetheless, the work is still effective and certainly useful to know in the field. This was, as always, a blast to record. Next time, whenever I get to it, I will be summarizing or going over Stuart Hall's and really basically all the notable Birmingham scholars' seminal work, Policing the Crisis, in which they discuss how the British media phenomenon of mugging was constructed and maintained during the 70s and how that led to Thatcherism. I think it's useful because it takes sort of all of the work that I've been reading about in this Turner book and related texts and synthesizes it into a very comprehensive piece, which demonstrates really the power of all these theories and methods when they converge, and something which, even though it is very much set in its media environment of the 70s, something which I think is still useful today. Thanks so much for listening.